Did they get that linkage fixed?
Which one?
The forward reverse the
Yeah, a little bit. Once you loosen it up.
We're live.
I'm doing it live. I'll do it live.
I miss I'm doing it live.
At the top on
Miss
the
vacation land, man. I'm excited to get down there.
Yeah, it's
Get on the boat.
I cannot wait.
Oh, it's gonna be great.
Should I bring my boat?
If you're into that.
I feel like that's almost disrespect to the sea hunt, man.
I know it's a lot of work, dude.
She's not going to know what to think. You know what I mean?
I mean, we'll at least let it stay on the list. Yeah. We won't move it out of the list.
Well, good morning, gentlemen.
Morning. Good morning.
Yes, it feels good. Be back.
It's been a minute.
Yeah.
Mid-July, early July.
It's been a while.
I feel like it was like July. I don't know.
Right about this time, I'm finishing up the next episode with Tori doing the call.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, which is cool. So it's cool you get to listen to it again, and listen back. He did a really good job on that call. It was a great call.
Tori brings the heat, man.
He does.
Tori does a great job implementing story.
Yeah,
he always has a story that matches the message, which is helpful. And that's probably why I remember the fact that every time he does a call, I'm impressed.
I always like the practical aspect of a story, how it ties into the reading.
He's always prepared. You can always tell when somebody's like prepared and they get on the call, or they're just going to go through what they've read, which is totally cool too. But sometimes they'll open it up with a question, or it just feels very intentional. And I always enjoy that. It pushes me too, because I've been guilty of getting on the call and just, I know it. I've read it. I understand it.
My last call was a little like that.
I have some opinions. Let's just talk about them, which is fine. But it always how you show up, right?
I feel like we've kind of the evolution of that call. It used to be like, let's highlight because when I do it, I gotta go through and I highlight what's important to me, and then I want to hit on those high points as I lead a call. Mm-hmm. And it seems like as more people have stepped up to lead the call, it's kind of morphed away from that a little bit to where more people are now giving opinions or stories and tying that back to the reading.
Yeah.
So interesting.
Which is organic. It's not like there's a structure to that, which is cool. I think somebody does a really good job and someone goes, oh, I like that. I want to use that.
Yeah.
So, well, cool. Well, gentlemen, man, this is, how's your week? Been good?
Really good.
Yeah, very good. I feel like I've stacked the last 2 days, so doing a better job lately of just less white space in the calendar on certain days, where you're in mode, you're really able to execute. So that's what my next 2 days look like.
That's great. I chipped my tooth yesterday.
I saw that.
That was cute.
On a fork?
Oh.
No, I bit into a sandwich.
Wait, that's a soft sandwich, so maybe your tooth was on the way out.
It was a piece of bacon. So, that's like sad.
Did you already
isn't it?
have that thing bonded?
I think I've broke this tooth like 30 times.
Yeah, I remember that.
It happens consistently. So, but I'm with somebody at lunch, and they're talking, and like I can feel that my tooth just broke, and I'm like, and they're talking. I'm like, okay, don't draw attention to this. Continue to pay attention to what they're saying. I'm trying to pay attention to what they're saying. And then all of a sudden I'm like, well, no, now that's definitely my tooth. I feel my tooth in my mouth. I was like, yeah, this is not a good situation. I'm going to have to excuse myself. So for the rest of the week, I get to walk around like a hillbilly.
So what's the plan to get it
from
fixed?
Kentucky, man.
Yeah, I am from Kentucky.
Yeah,
there you go.
Kentucky people wouldn't think of that.
There you go, man. Mm-hmm.
Why the rest of the week? Did you save a little piece?
No.
You didn't swallow, did you?
I don't think so. I don't think so.
I chipped my, this bottom one's bonded. The best part of the story is at a wedding, and I had a cold Corona Light at my hip. I wasn't dancing or anything.
I remember this.
And the groom did like this spin move, hit it, pops right up, hits me in the mouth. Tooth comes out. I catch the tooth, put it in my pocket, keep dancing.
Don't break your stride.
Now that's actually true. That was Ben O'Donnell's wedding. It was in Clearwater Beach. It was
all in sequence.
It was funny because it was funny at first, and then I went to the bathroom and I looked in the mirror and I was like, "Oh my God!"
I feel like I remember that story.
And then it started to hurt later. The air starts to hit it.
Oh, that's a tender spot when that.
Yeah, they can get me in next Monday. So.
No, it's just a top piece. Yeah, it was just a little chip.
Little root exposed on the top.
Yeah. There you go.
That'll get your attention.
There you go.
Speaking of that, risk, man.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Exactly.
you guys are risky, man. Yeah, I don't have any teeth chipped.
You buy insurance for teeth
Okay,
chips?
I mean,
Get some good dental. Yeah. Well, I thought it'd be fun to talk about risk today in regards to a couple different aspects. Obviously, being in the insurance business, we see this on a daily basis, and these are conversations that we're having with customers all the time. But there are also conversations that we're having between the three of us with strategic initiatives, with growth plans, with new hires, new markets, different marketing initiatives, pretty much every aspect of our business. I mean, there's risk versus reward, right? That's really what business is about. So it's an interesting dynamic between the colliding factors that come from we're in the business of risk in a sense of mitigation. However, I know a lot of, in our heart and souls, we're very entrepreneurial and we like to take a lot of risk. So there's this dichotomy that comes from this balance that I think is great because honestly, if we weren't in the insurance business, I think we might be in trouble. Because we like to roll it up and get after it. But there's some cool concepts that have kind of evolved over the years in conversations that we've had that either talk about different strategies that we're using with clients that help them build prudent growth strategies or conservative, smart growth strategies. And then there's also concepts that we've adopted and injected into our own business and making sure that we're being prudent and we make good decisions. And then there's also times that we've done and said, you know what, prudent is prudent. We've been prudent. We're ready to roll the dice. And this is one of those situations where we're just aware that there's more risk and we're okay with it for whatever reason that is. So I thought that would be cool and a cool platform to kind of share some of those philosophies, how you guys think about that, and how that maybe some experiences in the past have kind of shaped our perspective on that. And then maybe talk about some of the things that didn't go necessarily real well and what we've learned from it, which would be cool. So, I did a video. I did a video on Instagram or LinkedIn, I think a couple of weeks ago, and it was about total cost of risk. And it got a lot of traction, which is interesting. I'm always kind of really sensitive to put stuff up about insurance, just because I feel like what we do is so much more than that. But at the same time, we are an insurance agency and we sell commercial insurance and personal insurance, and that's what we do, and we do it well. So I think it is obviously good to put a lot of that stuff out there. But it was funny. I got a ton of responses from that, really good responses from that. And it kind of reminded me that these things that maybe we take for granted are not they're not self-evident to most people, right? They don't think about risk every day. They're thinking about growth. Risk is one of those dirty words that you don't really want to acknowledge. So I did a video called basically about total cost of risk. And it's the concept that we all have a certain amount of risk in our lives, in our businesses, and in our daily, habitual things that we do. And there are a couple factors that come into play on that. But, just because we don't buy insurance doesn't mean that we don't have the exposure in a sense, right? So the total makeup of how we run our companies and how we run our businesses will determine, in the volume at which we do it, will determine obviously what our exposure is for risk. But there's only a couple ways to really handle that, and whether we decide that you talk to somebody and they say, I hate insurance, I don't buy insurance, which happens all the time. Or you talk to somebody and they insure everything. The fact of the matter is that doesn't necessarily, their total cost is their total cost. And whether they choose to transfer that off to the insurance company for a premium, or whether they choose to perform some risk management strategies to actually reduce that exposure, there's a couple ways that they can go about that. But it still doesn't neglect or avoid the fact that there is exposure there with the way that they run their deal. So we're going to kind of talk about that real quick today, and what you guys' thoughts on that are, and ultimately maybe how that kind of comes back to ties into Erb and Young.
Yeah, when I think about risk, I think about the downside. When I think about buying insurance or how much insurance to buy, or even down to vetting opportunities or making decisions, how everything kind of flows through is to really just considering the downside. What is that downside? What is that cost of risk, if you will, if things were to go bad, along with balancing the likelihood of things to go bad. But furthermore, what actually would be the loss? What would be the devastation? What would be the worst case scenario? And then just kind of work from there. So ultimately, the way my mind works is immediately to the downside and then working to mitigating that downside. And one of those, options is buying insurance in certain cases, right? So if there's a downside of building a home because it could burn down, well, one of the ways you deal with that risk is you pay money for an insurance policy that mitigates a portion of that risk. It's not all the risk, right? You have a deductible or you have a premium that you pay. So it's funny because I think insurance is a very practical way. That exercise, when you think about should I insure something or should I not, or how much should I insure, or what should my deductibles be, to me kind of parlays into how you run your business and the way you make decisions on growth, opportunities, acquisitions, new hires, all that stuff.
It's like it's almost as if, it's not almost as if, this is probably exactly how it is, but you're either transferring the risk off for real cost right at the moment, right? So for a homeowner's policy, right? You're like, look, or you're assuming the risk for potentiality, right? So for what it potentially could cost me. So, and that's an interesting point right there, right? So some people would rather self-insure that, which makes sense. I self-insure some stuff all the time, but that doesn't necessarily negate the fact that there's still that exposure there. So would you rather transfer that off for real cost right now? That's probably more minimal. Or would you rather hold on to that yourself for a later, bigger potential?
You mentioned, it's along those lines, you mentioned the dichotomy between being an entrepreneur and being an insurance firm, right? And I think it's interesting to think about the people that we work with. We would consider ourselves pretty conservative insurance agents, I would think, right? And a lot of that goes into learning the person that you're talking to, learning their risk tolerance. That's got to be a conversation. It's got to be part of it. But then pairing that and having the other conversation where we necessarily would roll the dice as entrepreneurs to say, we'll self-insure that or advise someone that that's an option. I think it's interesting to hear both your points, but realize that without a conversation about risk tolerance and really truly understanding who you're sitting across from, I mean, to me, it doesn't match up. You got to know the risk tolerance of the person you're dealing with.
Right.
We talk about that all the time on the commercial side. It's like if your risk tolerance is I hate insurance, right? Then we just explain the rules if you decide to not transfer that risk to an insurance agency or
Right.
for an insurance carrier.
Right.
So the first thing I think about is the fine line between the dichotomy that you mentioned of us as entrepreneurs and then us as an insurance firm that I would consider pretty conservative, versus the risk tolerance to someone that may say, man, I don't really care for insurance. I'd just soon insure it myself, and the rules that go along with that sort of engagement.
Sure, which is totally cool.
Yep.
Which is totally fine. Insurance is just a tool, right? Insurance is one of the tools in the toolkit to reduce your potential cost. Right. So, and that's a great point, right? So taking someone's risk tolerance from over here and trying to bring that over and have that conversation with somebody else before you've skipped a step, right? And that kind of comes back to us from an awareness standpoint, knowing what our risk tolerance is being. That's what's interesting because we have three of us.
Well, I don't think early on we were. I think we were way more conservative early on where it came to the three of us, right? And I think as we've learned a little bit more and we've gotten a little bit more experience, I think we've kind of loosened up a little bit where our businesses are concerned. But I don't think that changes our philosophy as risk advisors to our clients, right? Unless someone is adamant that their risk tolerance is okay without insurance, it's okay not transferring the risk, then it's just a matter of making sure that we as good advisors can have conversations with them about what those rules of engagement look like.
And what that means.
Absolutely.
Right, no surprises. So, walking somebody through, okay, that's your decision, that's totally great. Here's probably how much liquidity you need in the event that this would happen. As long as you can answer this with a yes, then by all means.
What's the rule that your dad used to say to you guys all the time?
Such a great line, man. What you can't afford to pay for in cash, you must insure. Man,
I've always liked that.
that's always stuck to
wise,
me.
right?
It is
It's
wise.
simple because if it's a low dollar amount, then you don't need to insure it because you can afford it in cash. And typically, if it's a higher, because what we talk about insuring is basically higher dollar amount things. I mean, we don't think about buying a widget off Amazon for $40 and insuring it, right?
Even though they ask you.
Even though they ask you, well, they ask you if you want to buy, whatever, travel, or if it gets broken on the way, or whatever it is.
Warranty.
But I don't know about you guys, but when I look at that, unless it's a big dollar amount, I'm not going to consider insuring it, right? That's just something that I would look at as a waste of money and not worth because the downside is not that great. If I lose $40, I would be bummed, but it's not going to prevent me from paying my next mortgage payment. Now, if that item is $5,000 and you pay that, and it's going to be $50 to insure, there's a conversation there that with yourself that you want to have, or with an agent, or with a friend, and that's the beauty. Because I think the one thing too about whether to insure or not is I feel like when you make decisions as a business owner, I feel like you're running through those same scenarios. I think you're looking at the downside. You're looking at these small little bets, because there's so many opportunities. We always talk about like how many opportunities you vet on a daily or weekly basis, and they all kind of look different, but then they all start to look the same, and you start to work through a process that I think is similar to, should I insure this or not? It's just hey, what's the upside here if this goes really, really well? What's the downside if this goes really, really bad? What are some things that we can, purchase, whether it be an insurance product, whether it be a training program, to mitigate risks along the way that would help us get further to, the best case scenario. So
Yeah.
that's kind of like what I look at as vetting opportunities is similar to, making decisions about whether you're, the risk conversation.
Yeah, I mean, the conversations I like to enjoy with customers is they immediately think you're going to go to insurance when we talk about a risk, and my immediate conversation is, well, what can we do to just completely avoid it, completely remove it out of the equation? Right. So the process for me usually is, and this is kind of with our own space. Okay, here this exists, this threat exists, right? What would have to happen? I love that you say that all the time. What would have to happen to remove it completely? To where you didn't have it, it was never an exposure, just you remove the exposure altogether. And to me, technology does a lot of that too, or process, or full, multiple stepped accountability checks. I could give multiple examples, but one of which would be wire transfers in offices, where it has to get clearance from multiple people instead of just one person having the clearance to be able to wire money. They wired money to the wrong place. But different things that you can do to where you just completely remove the exposure altogether, which means you don't have any reason for insurance, because you actually truly reduced your cost of risk by practicality, or bring it down significantly minimal. And if I can bring it down significantly minimal, well, to buy an insurance product or to transfer that risk off to an insurance company, they're probably going to give me the same rate as somebody that didn't take those risk management strategies. So then I'd go, it probably makes sense for me to self-insure it because I could beat the market. But if I haven't done anything and I don't want to do anything, or I don't know of anything that I can do, okay, well then that probably makes sense, because the data supports what it costs to actually insure that. If I can't afford to pay it, at that point, I'm probably just gambling. So we've got to have that conversation. But I love watching their face light up when you start talking about things where you can just completely remove it, because it's counterintuitive to just selling insurance, right? They think you're the insurance sales guy. You're just trying to sell them more product.
Right.
But I feel like we have a very different perspective, because, when you're building business, that's the first way you think about it, right? What could we, in my opinion, insurance is the last option. It's the last option. It means I don't have any solutions that are going to remove this. I don't have many solutions that are going to completely mitigate this. So at this point, this is just, part of the deal and collateral damage for moving in this direction. I need to go ahead and transfer this off to go ahead and protect myself.
Well, I think what you're saying too speaks to our style of just because we sell insurance doesn't mean everybody needs insurance.
Right.
And I think a lot of people find themselves a little less armed, or a little more disarmed, I guess, not so much on a defensive, when we're willing to have a conversation about, are there ways to lower this exposure or eliminate this exposure? Therefore, we don't need to sell you insurance. We want to be a trusted advisor at your table, not because we're going to sell you insurance every 5 minutes, but because we want to have higher level conversations that may help you decide and understand and maybe even discover that an exposure that the typical business class you're in would buy insurance for. But I mean, have you ever met an entrepreneur that didn't like to gamble a little bit? Okay, so if you can talk to them and have that conversation with them about how to potentially lower or eliminate an exposure, I mean, to me, there's what you've just talked about, the fact that that's one of the reasons we believe we bring a little bit more value to the market.
Here's a story for you when you talk about an insurance agent selling insurance. How about a surgeon that all their answer is to do surgery, right? And I know when I got out of school, I had a torn labrum, and at one point it was very painful. And then by the time I got into the pre-op room a couple weeks before surgery, I'm having a conversation with the surgeon, and I kind of just let him know, hey, look, should I have surgery? Because I have range of motion back. My pain has subsided pretty significantly. And we had that same conversation, but in a surgery type setting. And I always appreciate the fact that as a surgeon who would have performed the surgery, he ultimately recommended to say, hey, look, if there's ways we can avoid the surgery, let's do that. And the you can always do surgery kind of thing. Now, it's not directly a parallel, but it is a parallel in a sense, because you should be having the conversations.
Certainly from a credibility standpoint, it's a parallel. Yeah. It's an applicable parallel. I mean, a surgeon. What does a surgeon want to do? They want to cut.
Yeah.
And you've got a surgeon that's saying, maybe if we can find another way not to cut on you, then let's have that conversation. I respect that.
Yeah.
I respect that.
It's always stuck with me too. I remember him saying, "What is there anything that you'd like to do that you can't do?" And I'm thinking to myself, well, I don't want to play basketball anymore, so but I can play golf. So yeah, no, I think I'm good.
That's great. Yeah, the risk management or lowering the exposure is a much better conversation, because it puts it in aspects of, maybe it is best to take this one on yourself. If you've done X, Y, and Z to protect yourself, then it may be worth rolling the dice a little bit.
I think too. I think as a consumer, you get worn out with cost, and I know as an operator, we sometimes get worn out with costs. I mean, sometimes it wears us out to have the conversations with clients that we know are maybe on the fence about insurance as subject matter, and wears us both out. So I just think that offering that perspective and being equipped to have those conversations with, and I don't want to disrespect your average entrepreneur, but as you get more sophisticated, they're going to be looking to have those conversations.
Well, yeah, and it's not a one size fit all, and it's not
for sure.
I choose to buy insurance or I don't. I mean, you can take significantly high deductibles, which max out the exposure, right? So that I can weather the storm if this happens. However, I'm also able to save in premium dollars. So I'm going to do these certain steps that mitigate my risk, but I'm going to cap my max payout and my max loss payout. So therefore, if the worst happens and something slips through the cracks, it's not gonna put me out of the game, right? That's the other thing too. It's like, you can make a lot of mistakes in this game. You just can't make the mistake that puts you out, because if it puts you out, then you're on the sideline,
right?
And you've got to start over. So I love what we do, because what we do is we get to have conversations with those individuals who want to talk about what are the things that could put me out of the game, what are the things that could potentially null and void everything that I've done up until this point. I mean, it's a huge responsibility. I take it with a massive amount of respect, because you're sitting there having a conversation about something that somebody's built something with their bare hands for a very long time, and they've put up blood and sweat and tears in this, and making sure that they don't have those surprises ultimately is what we're charged to do. It's not to just find the best insurance premium. That's just fact. You gotta do that to be able to come to the table. But what I would want from an advisor, or when I'm talking risk, is I would want to have a conversation and then bring all the stuff that could happen, so I know what the exposure is. Because as long as I know what's out there, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with making those decisions, and I'm okay with gambling a little bit too. I just don't want to. I just don't want to be bit by the snake that I didn't see.
And I think too, and this just may be me, but it's like gambling with a liability. Liability scares me much more than a property issue, right? Property, it's like, oh, do you want to insure, your personal property within your office? It's like, to me, it's like, even if it's a high dollar amount, it's not going to be, $500,000 or $1 million. But any liability suit could be. So I think you start on the liability side when you talk about, okay, what are the catastrophic things? And then you work back to weighing, stuff like property and different things that are related to that. That's what I think, specifically like in our business, of course, like you can't operate without error and emissions insurance, because so much of what we do is giving counsel, guidance, and executing transactions that, a mistake without insurance could be a big issue. So same thing with workers' comp, obviously, if an employee gets hurt and so on and so forth, you go down the line, but it's interesting.
It always fascinates me when you think about the insurance that people are required to buy. That's an easy conversation. And by that, I mean, workers' comp or liability in certain cases. But it always fascinates me the number of people that don't understand property insurance is meant to pay you, where casualty insurance or liability insurance is meant to pay others. So to me, that's got to weigh into the conversation to make sure people can delineate between the two. And it surprises me, honestly, the number of people, even sophisticated business owners or operators, that don't understand the difference between the two.
Right.
I think that's very, very important to build that into part of your discovery when you're trying to understand and realize someone's risk tolerance.
Not assume that stuff. Yeah,
Right.
I find myself battling that all the time. I think anybody in any space has to battle that, because what you just automatically, it's everybody who niches anything. What you know it well, and you assume some stuff, and that's just so deadly. It's so deadly because that's a simple thing, like you just said. And I just thought about it. I said, man, that's probably true. I don't know if I go through that on my discovery just to make sure. Hey, I just want to make sure this is clear.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, what about startups, man? I know we work with a lot of startups, on a weekly, monthly basis. Obviously, we were a startup. What are some ways that someone can de-risk a startup? Obviously, a building burning down is one risk, but in business, there are many more risks other than just casualty claims and property claims, right? There are risks that are out here that we can't even insure, right? So let's talk more broadly for a sec about, risk in a sense. What are some things that you guys think, either A, if we were going to do it over again, that you would do differently to de-risk, or maybe some things that, we did that you liked that de-risked the startup, or maybe somebody that you've worked with that's done some stuff to kind of de-risk their situation, because it's a big thing. People put it on the line when they're starting a business, and there's a lot at stake.
Yeah, I think it goes to the downside conversation. Like for us, I feel like when we started, we risked, our biggest risk was our time. It wasn't capital. So when I look at that, I think about like the whole cliche, like you have to spend money to make money kind of thing. And that ultimately, that for a lot of people, I think that's not great advice. I think, maybe for some people that know a business well and know the metrics well, that, throwing money at something that already has a good rate of return and it's just going to perpetuate, that's a different conversation. But when I think about startups, I just think what you're going to risk. Is it your capital? Is it your time? I'll just say for me personally, like literally the conversation that I had with myself when we started the business is, okay, what's the worst case scenario? Like, okay, I'm 23 years old. I go waste 2-3 years in a career learning a lot of different stuff and it doesn't work out. My downside wasn't that bad, right? Like I know that at some point I can go get a job or start another business. So that all went through my head. So I was willing to risk the time, and it wasn't really a big risk. Mm-hmm. But if it worked out, it could be an exponential gain. And so that's how I kind of viewed starting a business and looking at different ways. If I looked at starting a business with you guys versus go getting a job, weighing that to where there was probably less risk on the front end, but there maybe wasn't this exponential return if it went well. So I was more okay with risking my time.
That's cool.
So for startups, I think about that as just what are you okay with, and I think that's the risk tolerance conversation.
Yeah, those are great thoughts. I had a meeting with somebody, I won't say when, but recently, and they're like, "Hey, I'm hiring for this. I'm gonna hire for this. I'm gonna hire for this." And I was like, "Are you sure?" And they're like, "Yeah, this while." I'm like, "Are you sure though? Because now you're risking something completely different because they're worn out. They're tired. They're just tired. They've been working very, very hard, weekends. I mean, they're doing the deal, and I have a lot of respect for this person. And the natural action or reaction is to try to move away from the pain, right? So right now the pain is no time. So the pain is to move away from that, and he's going to hire a couple people. But now you're risking something completely differently, right? You're risking their livelihood. You're risking your livelihood. You're risking your family now. You're risking your obligations, which may be the right move for them. It may be the right move. But are you consciously understanding that right now you're risking being exhausted and being tired and maybe losing some small time and window with your family to build this for them and yourself? And although that's exhausting, I get it. But now you're moving over to a different level of risk, right? Nothing's really changed as far as your output, as far as revenue is concerned. But you're shifting where now the risk of the deck is. Now, maybe you see an exponential return from that and you're ready. I'm not saying that you have to do that at some point, but it is important to consciously understand that your time is what you're risking, and that's the best thing you can risk, right? Early on, that's a great way to do it. That's a great way to de-risk. Instead of putting capital into something and risking that taking away from other things and all the baggage that comes from that, what you can do is you can burn the candle at both ends, and you can get after it for a short amount of time. So that's a great point, and I agree with you. That's a great way to think about it. What about you, man?
I think about with a startup, and those are both great points. I tend to go a little bit more toward cost. You say, well, we're talking about de-risk. Why does cost matter? Because I think about cash flow being such a risk for a new startup, and I think directly to insurance costs, right? I mean, how do we control insurance costs to help reduce risk of a new business? And specifically what I'm talking about is when you sit down with someone and they're forecasting sales and they've got a great idea and they've got all these plans to grow it big, and they say, I'm going to do $1 million my first year. Well, we know that's a guess. We know that forecast is a guess. There's nothing proven. I think for me, I'd rather see people be a little bit more conservative with their forecasting, which in theory is going to lower their premium. Clearly, we need to get it in line. It's got to be appropriate so that the carriers understand that what they're insuring and everything is in line.
That's a great point.
But there's no proof of sales. There's no proof of concept. You're a new business owner. You're a new operator. And while you want to go grow it big and put this revenue on the books, we don't know that yet.
Right.
So I find that more often than not, that's a place that I think is almost a universal place you can go to.
Can you explain that a little bit more for everybody that's watching and listening? So, because when I shop my insurance, I tell you these conversations. You ask me a bunch of questions, I give you the answers, then you return a rate back to me.
Right.
I don't understand how that works. So, what is it when someone's giving you those answers that's driving that? And why? Just kind of more the engineering.
Yeah, well, I mean, to me, it's like if you're meeting with a lawn care company, or someone that's opening a new lawn care business, and you're, or depending upon whether they're rated off of payroll or whether they're rated off of sales. Either way, I think the instinct is to go a little higher with those, right?
So meaning I'm starting my business, I'm going to hire 3 employees. They're going to be doing this, and
my payroll is going to be.
And you go, oh, what's the payroll? And you go, well, with the 3 people, this is going to be $150,000.
Right.
And then halfway through the year, they find out that, man, you know what? I don't want to hire anybody, and then end up being one person. So now they overpaid for
right, or they've not generated enough business to go with that original $150,000 forecast of payroll.
Got it.
And halfway through the year, they're at 75, or they're not, or 3/4 of the year, they're through 75.
Got it.
But we've paid for 150,
Right.
right? When we could have probably, I don't want to say understated, because I don't want to, we just don't know.
Well, call it what it is. I mean, I appreciate you being politically correct, but let's call it what it is. They're a startup. You haven't done anything yet,
Yep.
right? You have a unique opportunity, right?
Right.
You're writing your own sale. Whether you forecast the most or you forecast the minimal, the bottom line is it is what it is. These insurance companies have minimums, and you got to hit the minimums. But other than that, there's no track record, there's no history. And the fact of the matter is, the startup is actually built into the underwriting guidelines, so they know that this is the way that it is. So I think this is good information for somebody that's listening. Because how many times you talk to somebody, they say I'm going to do $3 million my first year, and they end up doing $400,000.
Right.
They're like, wow, I ran into this issue. There's risk that's a beta built into the whole startup that you should probably take into a factor when you're giving these numbers. So that's a great point. Do you have that conversation when you talk to somebody initially? Do you try to help them understand that before they give you those numbers?
To me, that's always part of how I personally do it. That's always part of discovery. When we get, because you always have to be able to justify to someone what their premium is. Everybody thinks their rates are their premiums, and that's a whole nother conversation. But you want to address what they're going to see when you get them that premium amount.
Right.
And then you want to explain to them the factors that go into that premium amount. Your rates are your rates. Your exposure is your exposure. Your premium is what's spit out at the end.
And the sales or the payroll would be what you call the exposure. So you have the rate. So how risky is that particular line of business?
Class of business, right?
Times the actual exposure. And what you're saying is you want to minimize that exposure in a startup because you don't know what you're going to do.
Right.
And therefore you could potentially have extra cost. And the biggest thing about that, Rod, that's a great point. The biggest thing about that is you're not going to call the carrier halfway through the year and say, hey, sorry, they're not doing as much as they thought they would.
Right.
That's a battle.
Right.
They don't like to change that.
Yeah.
They have no problem raising it.
Right. Right.
But they have a real fundamental problem.
Well, and I think if
lowering
you ever get a break, it's out of the gate, right? Because after year one, now we've got some history.
Right.
Now, if I come back to you for your renewal and I say, okay, we budgeted you, or we planned for you doing 100,000 in sales, and you actually did 500,000 in sales. Okay, now we're faced, are you going to be audited? If you're audited, we're going to make that right. But if it's a policy that isn't going to get audited, or they happen not to get audited, now it's like, now we need to put you more in line with what you will likely do the next year. So just because your premiums have gone up doesn't mean your rate has changed.
Yep.
It's just a matter that we've brought your exposure more in line.
You sell more pizzas.
You sell more pizzas,
exposure.
exactly.
Yeah.
Well said. So I just think that if you're ever going to get away with that, and I don't mean that in a slick way.
I know what you mean.
If you're ever owed that, the market is going to give you that out of the gate for the first year.
Yeah, and an even better way to say, if you're ever going to not be penalized for under-reporting,
Correct.
that's the time.
That's absolutely
right? You're
what
being conservative. You don't know the answer. We all have what we really want to do, and then we have what we think we're going to do.
Sure.
And some of us, like Rod Erb, they think they're going to do this, and then they know they're going to do this. It's always the top.
I think too, if you're a new startup, if you're a new business owner, I think that, at least from a lot of the conversations I've had, it's almost like people are insecure about thinking they'll do less than what they say. So they want it to sound like it's more grandiose, or sound like it's already more successful than what it is. It's like, it's the numbers.
And they don't know that that's what's driving the premium anyway.
Correct. And it just makes to me, that's one of the most useful conversations out of the gate. It's like, that's
a cool, so here's another thing that I've found with new startups that has hurt people in the insurance. And I don't mean to go on a tangent on this, but some people will, have you ever had the business that says All Services Inc. or Everything Handy Inc.? Or it's like this really broad name that basically says that you do it all. And then you go to the insurance company and try to tell them, oh, well, no, they actually are an AC contractor. And they go, yeah, but it says they do everything in their name.
That's a true
landscaping and tree trimming. Like, no, we don't do
tree trimming. Well, why'd you put it in the name? Well, just in case we want to later on, we thought it would be a good idea, which makes sense in theory.
Yeah.
But you always run into these big problems where the insurance company's going, hey, dude, we're not in the tree trimming business. Oh, but they don't do that. They don't do that. They're not doing that. Yeah,
Well,
but
which is important when you're having the advisor conversation. Don't you wish you'd get that call before
you
the
do.
business started?
Yeah.
Just to say, hey, here's the concept. We're ready to roll. We're going through the process.
Yeah, be careful what you put on your website.
What do I need to be thinking about from an insurance? And that's where you hope to be for someone, is to have those conversations.
You know what's interesting though is you said something, Taylor, a couple weeks back about create the demand.
Mm-hmm.
And then figure out, or how did you put it?
You create demand first.
Create the demand first. Like, it's
supply.
like if you're a landscaper, or you're doing something that's got other things that could be added on, create the demand first. Almost, be conservative in what you expose to the world, especially in this day and age where underwriters are on your website probably before they even consider, who you are as an operator.
My favorite is the local bars, which I love them, but they'll tell me they don't have any drink specials, which is fine. And then I go to like the Facebook page, and the underwriter goes to the Facebook page, and Monday through Thursday, ladies drink free for 5 hours.
50-cent
and
beers.
It's like, guys, just at least don't put it up on the website. But of course, you're going to market it. But it's like, in this day and age, it's going to be out there, right? So it's a very good idea to get with an advisor first and say, okay, what does this look like? Here's what I'm looking to do. Because if somebody brought that up to your attention beforehand, it's like, oh, you're going to run into this problem. Here's why. Oh, well, then I don't want to do that. We actually don't make a lot of money from that. It's just,
or it's incidental.
Right. So these are all conversations that are great to have.
Simpler is definitely better out of the gate. Simpler is better. And
that's good.
Another thing I think about too, while you guys were talking, is from a startup perspective, is like how you view, like I think about making a lot of small bets and then kind of following the smoke is how I view opportunities. So if you're starting a small business and like, okay, I'm going to go all on this, I'm going to spend a bunch of marketing dollars in this bet that this product's going to work out. Well, okay, that may be great if it works out, but what if it doesn't? And you have to come back and figure out what you're going to do. And I just think about all these small bets, and then, figuring out which ones have a lot of traction, and then doubling down on those once they have traction, figure out which ones maybe are a little bit more of a challenge, but they're still worth it. So you're still okay to invest some time and money.
Yeah.
I think about that for us as an insurance agency, as personal lines and commercial lines.
Yep.
We got into it as essentially personal lines was always going to be, not always, but initially going to be the core part of our business. And commercial was something that we knew would be important at some point, but there just wasn't the level of investment and time. It's quite a bit more complex. And so it was like this constant conversation, like, should we just go all in on personal lines? It was like, we should probably invest more on personal lines right now, but no, like, let's invest in commercial, because at some point this is going to matter. Here's why. And just having all those conversations. And of course, now come full circle, that investment's been a good one, and still one that we constantly, look at as far as different sides of our business and where we're going to invest. And so
that's a great perspective, because I remember that was a pinnacle moment, because we had been, let's just call it what it was. We've been struggling for 3 years. We've been making good growth, but as far as, being able to make, a livable wage, that I know we've been very candid about that in past episodes, but we were just getting traction on what we knew worked.
Right.
And we were like, wow, okay, now we're starting to build significant momentum. And I remember we had the meeting, I think was it at Dad's office?
Yeah. Was it
Edward Jones?
It had to be like 2013, 2014.
Yeah, and we sat on that table.
So 5-6 years ago or something.
And we had this conversation about this, and it was
7 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I remember it was a pinnacle moment. It was like, well, hold on, does this make sense? We've got all this momentum, right? Shouldn't we be dumping all of our energy on this and putting gasoline on this? And the answer was yes, but just a little bit of diversification. Yes, we're going to put the majority of the resources, but a little bit of diversification. And man, that's probably the epitome of what it means to have a reallocated portfolio, right? Like, you're always looking at where your opportunities are and where your threats are, and you're usually not all in on one thing. You're usually majority all in, so you gain momentum, but you usually have that comes back to this asymmetric risk that we've talked about. And I know we've had a lot of conversations about this, but seeing that if something goes wrong, I have a capped or a minimal or marginal downside. But if it goes right, I have an exponential return. I have, 4x, 5x return. And I look at that as like an opportunity for us where, we didn't know what we could have saw a shiny light and gone all in on commercial too, but then that would have been irresponsible. Right. So there's a balance there that I think is really, really
well, I think it speaks to the fact that we started out pretty simple. I mean, personalized. It was a simple conversation, and it wasn't easy, right? It wasn't easy to figure that out. It wasn't easy to learn how to walk, if you will, but it was still a pretty simple plan to start with. Sure. And then, like you said, as commercials started to become part of the conversation, realizing that wasn't as simple, nor has it been. But I just think that goes back to our conversation about the business owner that has all these great ideas. Well, what's your one core that you want to come out of the gate with? All the ideas that you have that are 2 and 3 and 4 and 7 and 10 years down the road, let's leave that out of the opening conversation. Let's talk about what you're good at, and let's talk about how we can control that cost and build momentum that way. And then you can slowly enter into these, and we can explain to you what that means to your question. Ultimately, is your total risk, what does it look like as that stuff gets added on? So I think that's interesting to talk about.
And I think this pandemic has brought different levels of like how you like. So when I think about the commercial thing, exactly what you said, it's like asymmetric risk in regards to, okay, what's the worst case? We waste a couple more years. We waste some time and resources, but the upside is so great, so much greater, right? As far as that side of the business it can be a very lucrative, explosive, profitable value add to the agency side of the business. So there was this upside, and then the downside wasn't that great. I think about like restaurants and bars right now too, and my heart goes out to them because it's such a brutal time during COVID-19 and all this. But then you also, there was these restaurants that didn't do Uber Eats delivery, even though I felt like the market was demanding it, right? Because I'm a consumer, and I order.
Well, we know.
I order my fair share of Uber Eats, and I remember having a conversation of like, hey, like it really bums me out when I don't see a restaurant on there, because ultimately I want your food, but I'm not going to ultimately go to your restaurant because it's 30, 40, whatever. I remember having that conversation. This was like two years ago. And it was always because Uber takes too much of our profit. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking, yeah, I know, but you wouldn't have it otherwise, right? And I don't know what it's like to own a restaurant bar, so I'm speaking a bit out of turn. But at the same time, now this challenge comes, and overnight you have to shift to takeout. What does it take to take out? What does it take to run a profitable restaurant on takeout? And so to me, that's like a small bet of like, even if I'm not figuring out this Uber Eats thing yet, I don't love the idea that they're taking 30% or whatever it is of the cost. But at some point, I see the market kind of trending towards takeout. People are going less to events, staying home a little bit more, the Netflix type generation. Maybe I learn this business and continue to break even on it, and then be positioned that when this hits, you're like, that's no problem. We'll just double down on our takeout because now that's what the market's demanding. So I think as business owners and as people, we don't know when those moments are going to come. We can only guess. It's like the conversation of like preparing for a rainy day. The whole concept of preparing for a rainy day is that you literally don't know when that rainy day is going to come. Or the old concept of like preparing for an unknown is like, it is an unknown. It's not what the last unknown was. It's not 2008, the housing crisis, that, it's like the devil It's like, no, it's the devil you don't. It's literally unknown. Yes. So I think the way you approach risk has to be the same way, as to say there's this level of unknown that you have to welcome into the conversation, because that's going to allow you to maybe prepare for the unseen in a responsible way.
Directly to your point.
That's so good. That's so good.
Directly to your point, how unprecedented would the risk factors be in conversations today, post-COVID or during COVID, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the things you would talk to someone about, the things we've seen, the stories we've heard from our client base. I mean, that conversation of a startup with risk is totally different. But that worst, would you have ever thought the economy would stop within a week?
So
You know,
what,
I mean, it's
what's
crazy.
interesting, right? We say no, but then now if it happened again, we'd be like, yeah, we do think so because it's happened before.
Right.
But when you think about like even the tech bubble, like the 2000s, right? That was unprecedented, right? And then you have the housing crisis, was unprecedented.
True.
In certain ways, right? You have this pandemic, unprecedented, right? It's new normal in every aspect. So it's not like if something's going to be next, and if something's next, however many years is going to be unprecedented. There's a fact that there is something looming out there that we will face that we haven't, although it looks similar to some things in the past, is unprecedented.
Good point.
And I think from an insurance company standpoint, living in the US, we have a very strong insurance market compared to different parts of the world. I'm grateful for it because it allows when the unprecedented strikes, whether that be, storms, but whatever it may be, that there's an insurance third party that potentially may help financially some of that burden, but which is
Great.
an interesting thing to consider. But that's how I approach risk, is that it's less about what you know and it's more about what you don't know.
Yep. Yep. And that's great. And that's probably more fiscal responsibility than anything else, right? So making sure you have enough chips tucked away, because the unknown that you're talking about usually is an uninsurable risk.
Well, and the diversification point that you hit on, people don't think diversification is sexy, right? From a rate of return, you'll hear people talking about from an investment standpoint, like if they're big real estate investors, they're all in on real estate because it's what they know. They know they could earn a higher rate of return. And from a math perspective, that's probably right. If you know real estate and you're doing flips or you're doing short-term rentals or whatever it may be, and you're making 12%, why would you put it in a market that's averaged to 6 to 7% over the last 70 years? You know what I mean? So you go, okay, that makes sense from a math standpoint, but what if the county stops allowing rentals? You don't plan for that, but at some point the diversification conversation is a risk conversation.
Yep.
Rather than a pure
Rate of
Return. Yeah, very
And
well said.
that's the number one thing that I think we all seek, that humility to know that we're going to be wrong at some point, and we just hope that when we're wrong, it's less of a downside and we can stay in the game and continue to play.
That's awesome. That's great. That's a great perspective.
I watched Rounders last night.
Did you really?
And it just
Yeah.
reminds me of how you'll know the line. You both will know the line where they talk about the hand that doesn't take you out, or whatever, however it went. But that's what that makes me think
But
about.
it's like poker is such a good example because like leaving yourself some outs,
right.
and
You talk about folding. It's the hand that you fold, not the hand that you win.
Yeah.
Basically, yeah, that's so true.
Yeah.
If you talk to any good poker player, they'll tell you. They'll never tell you their. If you talk to anybody that's really good, they'll never tell you about the hand where they won a bunch of money. They'll tell you about the hand that they folded, that they're so proud of.
Right.
They'll tell you that they mucked kings pre-flop, and it was the highlight of their career. And they were right. And everybody was so mad, and they thought they were cheating.
Or ace nine.
Yeah. They'll never tell you how they rivered somebody and took the whole pot.
Didn't he have ace nine in the beginning of the movie?
I can't remember, man.
And
It's been a
he
minute.
flops a boat, or he makes a full house, and the only way you could have got beat is if KGB had aces and he had aces.
exactly.
He had a higher vote.
ridiculous.
And then got him on the straight, or on the.
had to go get a job, man.
That's great. Well, dude, what's funny? I literally wrote this down, which is because poker, for those that don't know, I played, I made college easier for 2 years playing cards in school. And that was when like World Series of Poker was big. That's when everybody played poker, right? You'd have 15 games going on 3 screens. And after that, you'd play for 8-hour session. You'd go to a house game, then you go to another house game. And we just played all the time. But you learned a lot about risk playing poker. If you played poker to grind, if you played poker to actually make money, not to just go make money that night, but you knew you're going to play 15, 16, 17 times that week, you thought very differently about each hand because you had that total mindset, the total cost mindset, instead of, most people make the mistake of, can I win this hand?
Right.
They think, what does he have? What does she have? Can I win this hand? What I learned was, how does this hand benefit me to get to my plan? And so there was a lot of different strategies that were deployed that ended up actually making me a much better player but it wasn't as sexy as I was previously playing. Dynamic, all over the place. Very combative, and every once in a while you do something. You'd be like, yeah, I got him. But then 4 hands later, you just dumped it all back. So you learn that if you just take a little bit, and minimize risk, all of a sudden, after 5 hands you played, it's like you took a big pot. But you didn't have the big risk of risking your whole stack. And I think about asymmetric risk the exact same way. And anybody who's played cards knows what pot odds are. And pot odds are, if it's $10 to play in this pot, but everybody's called around the room and the pot is $80. So I'm putting 10 to win 90 at that point. So I'm laid up, I get odds, right? So my hand range can be way looser and way worse than normally if I was just straight up 1-to-1 odds. So I look at that as asymmetric risk. So if I'm coming around the table and I know I can enter this pot with really good pot odds, my risk of losing the hand is only $10. But if I flop something really good, all of a sudden I can win 90. Or actually more than that, I might be able to stack somebody because I might be able to take their whole stack because they didn't realize that I had a shitty hand. So you learn about asymmetric risk and you learn about odds and you learn about risk. But the baseline of that game, in my opinion, is small wins with very minimal risk add up to big returns. So and then you look at any tournament player, especially early on in a tournament, they don't want to be all in. Like, it's the worst case scenario. It's the worst case scenario.
Yeah.
It's avoid being all in at all costs.
Interesting.
Because you're leaving chance. There's risk factors.
Yeah.
If I don't go all in, if I'm not putting all my chips at risk, I'm not going to go out. So if I just take little bits and pieces or go for little pots, I'm not leaving the river card to chance. Most people are like, oh, I got so unlucky. Well, yeah, but you were all in 4 times.
Right.
Like you might have been unlucky on that hand statistically, but let's add up statistically on all of the hands that you were in on. Actually, you're not unlucky at all. There's actually a probability that was going to happen. And I look at that in business almost identically. It's not necessarily just this venture that I'm going to do. It's not just this risk that I'm going to take. It's, well, I've taken 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 up into this point. At some point, I'm probably going to get unlucky. So I should be acting as if at some point that unknown is going to happen. So take little pots, and then all of a sudden you wake up and it's like you were all in, with one hand because you just took a couple of little ones. So I know it's a poker rant, but that's for all the poker players.
No, I could have used that
last week.
Last week. But yeah, I remember how into poker you were. I mean, you were reading every book and you always seemed to relate it to risk in business. And I think that's super practical. Makes a lot of sense.
I forget what year it was. Brett's like, you got to read. Is it Super System?
Yeah,
that was a great book.
It was a Doyle Brunson.
He says you got to read this. You got to read this book.
I think I read that. The book was just like mudded at some point. It was like just mangled. It was fun.
I've got it on my iBooks, and it's funny. Every time I open my books app up, I see it. I'm like, that's because
great.
of Brett Young, man.
God, I miss those days, man. I miss those days. Those are fun. So. Well, what's the riskiest thing you think we've done in business? What do you think is the riskiest thing, and why was that okay?
I mean, I know what I think all of our answers would be, but I mean, to me, the obvious answer, the riskiest thing we ever did was purchase Melbourne.
Yeah, this book of business over in Melbourne.
Yeah, I think for a few reasons. I mean, I think there was a financial risk. It was it was borrowing more money than we had borrowed before as far as our Erb and Young experience. It was also venturing into a market that we had never been in before, right? So there was unknown there. And there was also an unknown of like dealing with so much HR and so many people that we had never met before, right? Mm-hmm. It wasn't just like a 1 to 2 person shop that, you get to know one, or it was, 7 outside of the 2 owners. So, I think but the thing about Melbourne that led us to be very comfortable is, again, I think it was a downside upside conversation, but it was also, we had vetted so many books of business in the past already, way before that. Almost every time we would look at a book of business and walk away, or we'd look at a book of business, make an offer, and ultimately it wouldn't go through, or we would actually execute on a book of business or an acquisition. It wasn't as unknown. It was just a bigger number. It was a bigger operation. So it was, when you have like go all in conversation, to me, didn't feel like you were going all in, because you had kind of understood the risk. You'd understand the return. You'd understood what the risk in execution and what that retention rate would probably look like. And are you okay with worst case? And then once you say, okay, that's a big number, but are you okay with worst case? And if the answer is yes, then I feel like the energy went into, okay, how can we mitigate and get this more towards a best case? And so pretty fun looking back at that.
I think about the point that you just made, Brad. It's like all the books we vetted, all the books we looked at and wanted to take a run at, all the books we made a run at, but maybe didn't get didn't work out. To me, I'd call those all, we just played a bunch of little pots.
Small, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it got to the point where we finally got to, throw some chips in on a little bit bigger pot. But I think we had controlled the odds a little bit in our favor, just because of all the earlier hands we played or attempted to play, but then maybe took chips back off.
Yeah,
the
it was
table.
almost like you didn't know when that opportunity was going to come, right? Figuring out how you secure financing, whether that be with a traditional lender or private, and all these different things you did along the way, and you exercise that part of your brain, and then all of a sudden somebody throws you this ball in the air, and you got your bat in your hand, and you go, I know this pitch. I gotta hit this, right? I can't watch this. I gotta hit this, and it may be that the odds are high because it's bottom of the ninth, but the pitch and you got the bat in your hand, and that's just a different feeling than, I have no idea what he's throwing, but I'm just gonna swing anyway because I know I gotta hit something, and that's how it felt.
That's a great perspective.
Yeah.
Love all these analogies, man. This is good. Yeah, those are good.
I wasn't ever a great baseball player.
No, they couldn't. You
So
fool me, man.
that's simply just an analogy for somebody else, because
Wrong ball.
Wrong.
Yeah,
Too
wrong
little.
ball. Yeah, so basically all three of those things, there's one thing you guys didn't mention, but we talk about de-risking something. We probably looked at, God, I don't know, man, more than you can count. Books of business, run them out, how they perform.
I would say 20 plus.
Rates of rate of return.
Absolutely.
How's that look? Positions. Where's the best way to position everybody to have success? I mean, all these things. You just go through so many run-throughs. Number two, these previous acquisitions that we had made, smaller ones, fairly small, but we learned the process of what it takes to migrate all the data, call out to the customer base, create the right PR, make sure you use the right language, how you get to the customer base to make sure that they know that it's okay, realizing that if they have the acquisition, a lot of people think that their carrier is going to change, and it has nothing to do with that, making sure that messaging is clear. A lot of things we learned throughout the process. How involved do we need the previous owner? What's valuable for them to do, and what's a waste of time for them to do, right? We learned a lot of that through that practice, and it was at a lower risk rate because it was a small acquisition. And then the third one I put down that I think is highly underrated was we rented a house here for a year. We decided, we mapped out, I don't know if you guys remember this, we put on the board what's the number one threat of this acquisition. And it was not money, it was not time, it was culture. And we talked about that. We said we're walking into a place that potentially, and we found out was the case, does not embody the same core values that we have. It does not have the same feel that we have. And we have always planted a flag and said that's the number one thing here at Erb and Young. That's what makes us different. That's our real competitive advantage. So to go into a new marketplace with a new group of people, with a new everything, and they aren't influenced by the current staff, that's a big threat. That's difficult. That's going to require us to be here. And we made a decision that all three of us are going to be here. This is too big of a moment in our time, in our history. So that's why we spent a significant amount of money renting a house close to the water, which was epic, and it was awesome. We had a great time.
That place.
But think about the cost. Think about the investment of that. in correlation with what the actual payment was on the asset.
Yeah.
It was a significant expense.
Yeah, it goes way beyond just what that rent was.
Basically, with that, all of a sudden, you're basically not cash flowing it the first year. I mean,
but that was like looking at the downside, but that was a way you could mitigate the downside.
Right.
So we said, willing to pay money.
We said, oh, we could not do this, and we could immediately get the cash flow from the business and do all these other things. But we immediately said you can't, because the culture is too important. So therefore, let's go ahead and put this in place. We're basically going to completely minimize return for the first year. And we're going to work on making sure that we create the same culture here that was there. And then the rest will take care of itself. Then we'll worry about the financial implications after the fact. So I look at that as a really bold move to de-risk the situation. And honestly, guys, I don't know if it would have turned out the same way if we wouldn't have made that choice. We just didn't have the leadership that was over here at the time. And I think that would be different today. But I'm very proud of that decision, because talking about risk management, talking about total cost of risk, and talking about strategies to deploy, that was an extremely responsible, intuitive, smart way to do that. And I would highly suggest that to anybody that's in the situation that they want to do that, because to transfer that over to another office, man, everything's a reflection of leadership. And I think it showed the fact that that this wasn't just a financial purchase for us, that this was a big deal to us.
And another risk factor was there was our core culture, if you will, right? What we birthed, what we took good care of, what we combed and petted and shampooed and made look all pretty and kept that going. And then you buy Melbourne, and then without doing what you did, you've got another culture, a different culture, different attitudes, different core beliefs, different viewpoints on things, and the risk that would carry, not only inside of that ecosystem, but how that would potentially puncture what we had done. Yep. When what we wanted was the absolute opposite.
Right.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, that's kind of like a parent that's like getting to retirement. Like, how do we get our kids to hang out more? It's like, well, do cool stuff. Make it a cool environment. Have some fun, and they're probably going to be more likely to hang out. It's like, that's what I think with the place in Melbourne. We were looking at different places to rent, and we were like, we're not renting an apartment that's near the office. We're renting something beachside, because we want to make this fun for us, but also fun for our team. And we're willing to, that was a part of that culture conversation too.
Most everybody used that house.
Yeah.
From at one time.
It was like a war room, man. Yeah. It was like you'd come there and throw stuff against the whiteboard and break out the wine, and then break out the beer, and
and then Uber Eats at
exactly
for the restaurants
Satellite Beach, man. They met. We put a dent in there.
We definitely helped the Domino's stock.
Oh,
but and then upside wise for that, it was a strategic play, right? So we didn't just buy this office because we wanted there wasn't a 1-to-1 pot odds. There was an 8-to-1 pot odds. We know that, and I won't go into the strategic initiatives of why that was important, but it had all these other intangibles where it would have been worth X to the agency down the street, but for us it was worth X times 5, because there was some strategic things that we had in play, and so we minimized that risk, and in turn we got that significant lift that we were looking for. Not even just financially, it was more just cohesively to create the right foundation for what we wanted to or wanting to do. So
yeah, it was all aspects of the upside. I think that's, you talk about infrastructure and team members, you talk about distribution in a coastal area, you talk about all that stuff was all part of the upside that I think it is important to acknowledge when you are vetting opportunities. It's like, that's why when you look at opportunities, there'll be another podcast, is if you take the financial gain out of an opportunity, what's left? And to me, there always has to be a strategic win. There always has to be one big problem. If you solve, ultimately solves 2 or 3. And the more problem that one big problem can solve, the greater the upside of the acquisition or the opportunity is.
That's so good.
And maybe we can get into that another time, because I think too many times you can fall in love with the financial rate of return. And that's why I always talk about, like, even when people way smarter than me can talk about money, finances, and investment opportunities, just because you're right doesn't mean you're going to be right. So it has to me to have a strategic to say, what if the finance goes worst case scenario? Do you still have something that you could justify and hang your hat on that you're going to move the strategic mission forward?
Great message. Right.
And if the answer is no, then you got to be okay with saying, okay, this is a financial play. We're okay with it. And here's why, but hopefully the answer is yes. So
Right.
That's a great message.
Well, I have an enormous amount of thoughts on that, but we'll just leave that for another time to talk. So we could sit here for hours. You guys are rock stars, man. I appreciate you guys.
Thank
as
you, boys.
always.
That was
So,
fun.
Yeah.
say bye.
Takes what it takes.
Say hi, Mom. See you guys.
You always say hi to mom, but never to dad.
It's true.
Hey, Dad.